version 30677. You will hear a number of different recordings, and you will have to answer questions on what you hear. There will be time for you to read the instructions and questions, and you will have a chance to check your work. All the recordings will be played once only. The test is in 4 parts. Write all your answers in the listening question booklet. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet. Now turn to Part 1 on page 2 of your question booklet. Part 1. You will hear a telephone conversation between a customer and the manager of a house-sitting agency. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Hello, Oz House Sitters. Adam here.
Oh, hello. My husband and I are going on a trip overseas, and we'd like someone to stay in our house and look after it while we're away. Is that something you can help us with?
It most certainly is. We can take care of all the arrangements for you.
Okay, great.
Now, can I just get some contact details from you for the form? Your name is...
Jenny Hall.
Thank you. Now, what's your address?
14 Grey Street.
Is that G-R-E-Y or G-R-A-Y?
A-Y.
Right. And what's the suburb?
Greenfield.
Oh, I know it. And if I can just get a contact telephone number?
I'll give you my mobile number. That's probably the best one to use. It's 0491 577 248.
Thanks. Now, when did you want the house sitter to start?
We're flying out on the 25th of September, but my brother will be in the house for a few days until the 28th. So from the 29th of September, please.
I'll note that down. And how long do you want the house sitter for?
Well, I'll be attending a training course in Paris for 2 weeks, but we're also going to visit my niece in Singapore on the way home to Australia for a few days.
So, shall I put down 3 weeks?
That sounds about right. I think 4 would be too long.
Sure. Now, Jenny, can you tell me more about the features of your house? This helps us to match house sitters and homeowners.
Sure. What do you want to know?
Does the house have air conditioning?
No, we don't like using it. We prefer the fresh air. But last year we did put in a pool.
Very nice. And are there any other attractive features? Is your house near a beach, for example?
No, not really. We're about an hour's drive away. But we are close to a station, so it's handy for anyone getting into work and so on.
Okay, great. Now, if our house sitter has their own transport, is there any space for them to park?
Well, we won't be taking our car, but it's a large double garage. There'll be space for one more.
Okay, great. I'll note that down too.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
And are there any special duties that you'll need the house sitter to carry out?
Oh, I don't know. What do people normally ask for?
Well, for example, one common chore is looking after the garden.
Oh, yes, we have an orange tree and an apple tree, which are both watered automatically, but we haven't connected the sprinkler to our lemon tree yet, so they'll need to water that one.
Sure. Now, Jenny, do you have any special requirements for your house sitter?
Well, I don't know if this is possible, but I'd probably rather have a couple than someone who's single. The house might be a bit too big for just one person.
Sure. Now, many of our owners ask for sitters without children. What's your preference?
Oh, that's no problem. There's nothing they can break.
What about smoking?
Oh, no. I can't stand the smell. Definitely not. Now, how do I know that my house is going to be safe with the house sitters?
Well, we check all of our house sitters very carefully. They have to provide references. But as well as that, you can ask for a police check if you want to.
Oh, yes, I'd like to do that, please.
OK, no problem. That's all I need for now.
OK.
That is the end of Part 1. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 1. Part 2. You will hear a manager talking to staff of a graphic design company about the move to their new office building. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Part 2. You will hear part of a radio program in which a successful businessman is advising listeners on how to become a self-made millionaire. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 16. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 16.
Everybody dreams of becoming a millionaire one day. So we asked Arthur Knowles, who made his millions in the plumbing business, to give the budding entrepreneurs among you a few tips on how to make your first million. Arthur, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sue.
So, Arthur, what advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, one thing I've heard people say is that when you're starting up a business, you can't afford to make mistakes. Well, I believe in the old saying, a person who never made a mistake never made anything. You can't really predict when you'll make mistakes, and you have to look at them as a positive experience, and one that means you won't make the same mistake again. You need to be able to cope with the world of business. But according to recent American business school studies, believing in yourself isn't enough by itself to guarantee success. Confidence can be a good thing, but a person can have too much confidence. And people who try to learn to be confident by buying those How to Succeed books are just wasting their time. The advice given in these American studies was that being a successful entrepreneur comes down to having the right attitude. It's no good getting depressed every time something goes wrong. Always keep your goals in mind and never give up. And don't listen to all the people around you who say, "Oh, this will never work." One thing I've learned in business is that you don't have to be an expert in everything, like marketing, for example. When I started my business, I tried to do it all myself, but I soon realised that although I knew everything there was to know about plumbing, I didn't have much idea about how to sell my ideas. So I got someone who knew more about this to take care of the marketing side of things for me. And as for leadership, well, you've got to be someone your workers look up to because you've been seen to make the right decisions. You have to be able to control people, but listen to them at the same time. Some people are driven to make their companies successful, but that too often leads to a ruthless approach. Then there's the question of taking risks, even calculated ones. I personally feel it's actually better to tread carefully when it comes to taking short-term risks. You need a degree of vision, certainly, but it's easy to get carried away by your desire to increase profits. And if things go wrong, you can end up losing more than you gain.
Before you hear the rest of the program, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 17 to 20.
So, if you have a great idea for a business, what should you do next?
Well, the first thing to ask yourself is whether there's a need for your product or service. Can you cater for people's needs better than existing companies? You don't need to worry about whether it's original or not because there isn't always enough of a demand for completely new ideas. And the second thing to ask yourself is not what colour should the packet be or how much should it cost, but do I care enough about this idea to dedicate the next 10 years of my life to it? Because realistically, that's how long it will take.
Tell us how you got started, Arthur. How do you explain your early success?
Well, I started my business just as the economy was going into a recession, which wasn't the best time, and I was lucky to survive, especially as the banks weren't being particularly supportive to small businesses at that time. If I'd listened to the business advice I was given back then, I'd never have got started. My strengths were that I knew I could provide a better service than my competitors, who really hadn't spotted the opportunities that were out there, and that my wife had a good job and was able to pay the household bills while I was getting the company on its feet. The first couple of years were very tough, but I knew I would make it eventually.
OK, now we're going to take some calls from listeners.
That is the end of Part 2. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 2. Part 3. You will hear a business student called Laura talking to her tutor about some research she is planning to do on employee absence. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Hello, Laura. Have a seat. So, I understand you're planning to investigate absence from work for your research project.
That's right. I'm going to base it on a local company called Burcock Engineering.
Is there any particular reason why you've chosen Burcock?
Well, I'd originally thought of asking another company, FG Engineering, because I did my placement there and I knew the staff there, but the CEO wasn't very keen. But she knows the managing director at Burcock, and she spoke to him, and then he got in touch with me. Apparently, absence is a major problem there, so he's quite interested in having it investigated.
OK.
So, my central theme is absence, but I'm thinking of concentrating on long-term absence. I thought that might allow me to give more helpful feedback to the company.
If I were you, I wouldn't be that specific. I'd look at absence as a whole. You might get more interesting results.
Oh, OK.
So what's the main thing you expect to find? Rises in absence rates over time?
Not really. Initially, I wondered if workers often take time off without real justification, but I think that'll be hard to determine. So, well, I think I may find that it's something to do with what sort of job the employee is doing.
OK. Now, have you thought how you'll get your information?
Well, first of all, I need access to the company records.
Yes, obviously you'll need overall absence figures, though it's unlikely they'll let you have them for individual workers. And you probably won't have access to personal information like when they were born, but you should be able to use anonymous details like the type of work they do or how long they've been with the company.
OK.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
So let's think a bit more about your questionnaire.
I know that it shouldn't be too long or people get bored.
No, but if it's too short, you don't get enough information. The trick is to get the balance right.
I think the questions should be closed questions too. I mean, where people choose an answer from a list.
But then you miss the chance of getting unexpected information, so I'd include 1 or 2 open-ended questions too.
OK. And I won't ask for names or addresses or anything.
No, it needs to be anonymous. And after you've drafted it, you need to give it to at least one person to check there aren't any problems. So you need to leave enough time for that and any revisions necessary.
What about the covering letter that I'll send out with the questionnaire? I'll need to introduce myself and explain what the questionnaire is for, but what else should I include?
I'd reassure people that the survey isn't going to be used to assess them personally. Otherwise, they might choose not to take part.
Yes, I'll make that clear. And what about when they do it? Will they be allowed to use work time?
That's really up to their manager, but you should say roughly how much time it'll take.
OK.
So now you need to produce a schedule with dates. For example, when you'll send out the questionnaire.
Yes, OK. Once I can arrange that date with the manager, I'll be able to fix the deadline for getting the completed questionnaires back. And I want to use the time in between to analyse the figures that HR is going to give me from their database, though they haven't said exactly when I'll get them.
And you have to submit your assignment by the end of June.
Actually, I have to get it finished by the 2nd because I've arranged a work placement after that.
OK.
So, our next meeting is 2 weeks today. Is that still OK?
Yes, and in the meantime, I'll send you an email.
That is the end of Part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 3.
Part 4.
You will hear an engineering student giving a presentation about a research project on design features of the International Space Station. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
For my presentation, I'm going to summarize the findings of a research project on life aboard the International Space Station in the early days of its operation, its teething problems, as it were. I'll start by giving a little background information. The space station crew were essentially a constantly changing team of scientists from different countries who lived on the space station for several months at a time, and they conducted a number of experiments, including some studies of living conditions in space, which is what I'm going to be looking at now. So, what was life like on board in the very confined conditions of the space station? Well, the early impressions recorded by the astronauts were very different from what people had expected. They'd expected that the air would smell stale or artificial, but the astronauts found that it was fresh. So that was one very positive finding. And although they were in such a confined space and people worried that it would get very hot, in fact, they found that it was very easy to turn the temperature up or down in order to keep it within a comfortable range. The feedback on the food was also positive. Astronauts on previous space stations had described the meals as boring, but the International Space Station meals were praised for their variety. So that was another good piece of feedback. And something which is taken for granted today, but was a key morale booster in those days, was communication between the space station and Earth, which the astronauts said was clear and reliable. So, in the early days, it seems that the mood was overall very positive. However, after a few days, the difficulties and frustrations became clearer. Above all, the crew complained about the constant noise caused by the air filters, which used to rattle and buzz 24 hours a day, interrupting their sleep. As well as that, the astronauts complained that the Velcro fasteners, which were positioned all over the station, didn't work well. And so, a lot of the time, objects weren't secure in the cabin but floated about. A particularly serious problem was that the systems used on the space station had been developed in a number of different countries, and they didn't always work well together. For example, it was impossible to mix the water produced from different systems because it contained different sorts of preservatives, and these reacted together and blocked the pipes. Another problem was connected to repairs. At the best of times, these took up an inordinate amount of time on the station, and the crew complained that many of the tools that they'd been provided with weren't suitable for the jobs they had to do. So they had to improvise, which meant that jobs took a lot longer than they needed to. Another related problem was to do with access to equipment that needed maintaining. Because the instructions on the equipment were often located in places where they were difficult to read, like on the back of equipment, it was often difficult or impossible to read them. So, having identified these problems, the researchers came up with a number of suggestions about how conditions could be improved on subsequent missions. First, it became clear that although there had been a great deal of consultation with the crews, the systems and equipment on the space station needed much more wide-ranging testing. Then, the whole issue of language training came under review. Astronauts from different countries had to be able to talk to the controllers on Earth and to understand them. Now, although they'd had extensive language training, the astronauts sometimes had problems comprehending what was said because they weren't familiar with the accent of the speaker. And this sometimes led to quite dangerous misunderstandings. Finally, and this is the point I found most surprising, the researchers felt that the designers of the space station were paying too much attention to safety rather than considering operating issues. That is, how the station could be run comfortably and smoothly. And the recommendation was to make changes here at quite a fundamental level. So, those were the main points I covered in the...
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the answer sheet.